In your statement, you tell us a little bit about your family's history. Could you tell us a bit about that history? Your father and his parents arrived in Australia from Germany before World War II, is that right?
That's correct, and that was to escape Nazi persecution. My father came first. He was very fortunate. He arrived in July of 1938, and then following Kristallnacht in November of that year, he immediately made application to bring his parents out, and they arrived 6 weeks before the outbreak of war the following year. So they were very fortunate to get out in time. My father was immediately taken with Australia. He loved the country, he loved the people. He served in the Australian Army during World War II from 1943 to 1945, and they struggled a lot financially because they had to start their life afresh. But they never looked back, and they were always very grateful for the opportunities Australia gave them, and of course the freedom.
And your mother is a survivor of Auschwitz?
That's correct, yes. She was not so fortunate. At the age of 16, she and her whole family were transported to the death camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. They were met on arrival by Nazi officials, including Joseph Mengele. They went through the selection process. My mother lost both her parents and her 3 younger siblings. Not even a photograph survives of her younger siblings. I don't even know what they looked like. My mother and her 2 older sisters survived. They were sent to work camps in Germany. Went through a succession of events that made it improbable on each occasion that they would survive, and yet, and they did. It was a succession of improbable outcomes, which is my personal definition of a miracle. And so my mother survived the camps. Her 2 sisters, her 2 older sisters, went to Israel, and so I have family in Israel. I had no family in Australia other than my parents. I had no uncles, no aunts in Australia. I grew up calling my parents' friends auntie and uncle, and that was quite common in our community. It was not unknown. I don't portray myself as unique in any way in that regard. It is a very common experience in the Jewish community.
And does that family history play a part in your identity?
Very much so. Although the unpleasantness of the Nazi years and the Holocaust were very seldom talked about in our household, I think my parents were probably trying to shield me from that horror. Inevitably, I picked up the vibe. I picked up a sense of what they'd gone through, obviously by the fact that I grew up without one set of grandparents and without aunts and uncles, so I knew why, basically, even if I didn't know the details of their story, because they weren't really spoken of.
And growing up in Australia, did you experience much anti-Semitism? Was that a presence in your life? Very
little. Honestly, there were so few incidents, and when there were, they were very low level. I mean, the occasional smart aleck remark in the early years of high school, and having grown up in the Australian milieu, I very quickly learned to give back as good as I got. So it really was very low level. I never experienced anything that I would consider to be serious anti-Semitism. There was perhaps one incident in high school that did not involve teachers or students. It involved a priest from a local church who was giving a scripture class, because I happened, when I was in my 2nd year of high school, I walked into the wrong scripture class by mistake, and tried immediately, as soon as I realised I was in the wrong place, to get out. And anyway, look, there was a bit of a funny encounter there, which in retrospect caused a lot of hilarity when I recounted it at our school reunion, but That was about it. It was very low level, nothing that you could compare to what's going on today.
And you went on to practice as a lawyer for about 32 years,
Yes.
Is that right? Working for a number of clients, trade unions, not-for-profits. What sort of work did that involve?
Well, it involved the full range of legal work. I mean, having trade unions as a client can involve anything from industrial law to criminal law to family law. I mean, I acted not only for unions and union officials, but also for many union members, hundreds of them. And I was very proud to do so, and still am. It involved a very broad range of work, but it also brought me into contact with areas of Australian society that I hadn't previously been in contact with working people in a whole range of different industries. Mm-hmm. And it gave me an appreciation also of just what a wonderful and free country Australia was.
You went on to be elected a councillor of the ECAJ in the early 1990s, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And then you were employed as its executive director from 2009?
Yes.
And when you first started in that role, was combating anti-Semitism one of your focus areas? How did it rate in terms of your priorities across different community and policy issues?
Well, this was 2009, and it certainly was an important area of our work. I mean, the ECAJ had been compiling annual reports on anti-Semitism since 1989, and so it was a focus, and it was becoming more of a focus because of the transformation in the type of anti-Semitism that we were encountering. So in the past, the most common forms of anti-Semitism were from the far right, from neo-Nazis, and they were very much on the fringe of Australian life. From 2009 onwards, as the anti-Israel movement started to gather steam here, we also started to see manifestations of anti-Semitism coming from the far left, and increasingly also from Islamist groups that started to become active at that time.
You say in your statement that early on it was still considered to be on society's fringes and still regarded as shameful. Did that perception change for you at a certain point?
It did change for me, particularly from October the 7th, 2023 onwards. But I have to say it was already developing slowly before then. If you track the number of anti-Semitic incidents that we were recording, you can see that there were ebbs and flows, but the gradual trend was up. But they would go up by maybe 35% in 1 year or 50% in 1 year, and when that happened it was remarkable, and it would be commented on in the media. After October the 7th, 2023, it went up by 316%. It was a different order of magnitude, and so it has changed our perspective, and I think it has changed the country.
You refer in your statement to the events of October 7 and then that protest at the Opera House on October 9. Based on your discussions with people in the Jewish community, what sort of impact did those events have on them?
I think that had a tremendous impact on the Jewish community in particular, but it also made media headlines around the world. It was so shocking to us in Australia, which we were used to as a peaceful, tolerant country where one of the axioms of politics was that elections are won and lost in the political centre, and now we were seeing a procession from the town hall to the Opera House, traversing half the length of the city of Sydney, under police escort, on a day that was supposed to be a day of solidarity with the victims of the Hamas atrocities in Israel 2 days previously, where there were people instead celebrating that event, and yelling out anti-Semitic slogans, F the Jews, where are the Jews? Some people heard gas the Jews, but whatever it was, whatever they were saying, it was about the Jews. And it was on the forecourt of the Opera House in the middle of Sydney on a day that was supposed to be a day marking the respect for the victims of the October 7th attacks in Israel. So this was something we never thought we'd see in Australia. This was something more akin to events that we had experienced in other countries, that the Jewish people had experienced in other countries at different times. And even though Australia is not the same as Russia in 1905 or Germany in 1933, nobody says that there's an objective historical comparison between those two things. But the emotional reaction, the triggering of historical and family memories, that's something you can't control. It's not subject to a rational process, and that is what we felt. And that is, I think, also what a lot of non-Jewish people were feeling too, and we were getting hundreds of messages to that effect, unsolicited, from all over Australia, from people of all backgrounds.
In the year following October 7, as you say, the ECAJ recorded its peak of 2,062 reported incidents, which was the 316% increase
Yes.
you referred to earlier. And you say that around this time you had conversations with people in the Jewish community asking whether they needed a plan B.
Yes.
What did you understand to be their concern around that time?
They were concerned about whether it was still safe to live in Australia, whether it was still the Australia that we all knew and loved, that we'd all grown up in. And so even though the number of people who actually made definite plans to leave the country and to go elsewhere, mainly to Israel, was very small, that's my understanding, the very fact that people were talking about it in such numbers and making inquiries and opening the process for emigrating was a first for me, and it was a shock. It's not something I did myself, because I was born and raised here, and I feel that, this is my country, and it's going to take a lot more than that to get me out of here. But the fact that there were so many people in my community speaking in those terms was a shock to me, and really set me thinking.
In your statement, you set out a number of the, I suppose, more notorious incidents of anti-Semitism that followed from October 7. I wanted to ask you about a couple of them. The first is the doxing of several people in the Jewish creative community in February 2024. Can you start by explaining, for those who may not know, what doxing is?
Yes, it's the publication of personal online details of people without their consent. There's probably a legal definition now in the criminal code, which is a lot more sophisticated than that, but in essence it's as I've just outlined it to you. And on that occasion there was a WhatsApp group of 600 Jewish artists, writers, musicians and other creative workers, and they had come together in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th because they felt that they were under pressure to publicly recant their Jewish identity as they saw it by publicly denouncing Israel. Now, a lot of these people, like me, and most Jews in Australia, have family in Israel and friends. And of course the Hebrew language and our culture and our religion and our civilization and values all come from Israel. So they were being asked, in effect, to turn their backs on their family, their friends and their heritage and denounce all of that by taking a public stand against Israel, which had just been attacked. And they couldn't understand it. And they felt also aggrieved by the fact that the people who they had worked with and befriended and mixed with socially were calling on them to do that.
Had you had discussions with a number of people in this WhatsApp group, and is that what your comments are based on?
They are, and there were two in particular that I recall. One was a woman whose mother had been in that WhatsApp group, an artist, but a passive member of that WhatsApp group. She hadn't really participated in any active way in the conversations, but she had just read them and had joined the group because she wanted to hear and get some comfort from people in her situation. And her online details were then made public as part of the doxing that occurred. This elderly mother, and then she started receiving hate messages online from people she'd never heard of from all different quarters, and it was causing her immense distress. And she asked her daughter to contact us to tell us about her plight and was there anything that could be done about it. That was one example. There was another, a friend of mine who has been active in the arts and culture sector for many years, has served on as a director of an artistic institution for many years, who was also doxed. Also had been a passive member of this WhatsApp group but had been doxed. Rang me to say, look, I'm all right, but I've got so many friends who've been calling me, telling me that they've received these hate messages and threats to ruin their careers, and what can we do about it?
You also say that, ironically, members of that chat group were, to a large extent, artists who actually disagreed with the policy of the Israeli government at the time and were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause.
There's a lot of sympathy for Palestinians as a people in my community. I don't want anyone to think that we're impervious to human suffering wherever it occurs. That's not the case. But let's just take a step backwards and understand that this was an attack that had been initiated by Hamas, which happens to be the most powerful organisation still in the Palestinian community in Israel and perhaps beyond. They had initiated this attack. They had done it in the most appalling way. They committed the most appalling atrocities, which have been documented endlessly. And they had announced that they would do it again and again, because their charter commits them to the destruction of Israel as a state and the elimination of its Jewish population. They make no secret of that. And this is often swept under the carpet in discussion in Australia, but we have to understand that that is what they stand for, and they are a very powerful element of Palestinian society, if not the most powerful element. And so there was no sympathy expressed for those who were at the receiving end of that treatment. And so when we hear the sorts of chants that Jeremy Stolinda talked about before, and we understand them as in that context of a movement to eliminate the state of Israel and get rid of its Jewish population, we see it in that context. It's not a matter of a fine political or philosophical debate about the limits of freedom of speech. It's not an exercise that you would do in a philosophy class when you're studying the great British philosophers of Hume and Locke and John Stuart Mill. For us, it's very real. It's about people who mean to eliminate members of our family and our friends.
You go on to talk in your statement about the firebombing of the Adass synagogue.
Yes.
And on your understanding, what was the extent of the damage to the synagogue on that occasion?
Well, I have visited that synagogue since, and what's left of it. The study hall that was attached to the synagogue was completely gutted and destroyed. The Torah scrolls, which are in the heart of the synagogue, which they are in every Jewish place of worship, were in a fireproof cabinet, but the fire was so intense that not all of them were able to survive the intense heat, and five of the Torah scrolls were damaged and had to be ritually buried, which is the Jewish tradition when a Torah scroll is no longer able to be used. And hundreds of prayer books, and of course the psychological impact of the burning of a synagogue. Again, I've said in my statement that my emotional reaction was to think of the burning of synagogues on Kristallnacht, because my paternal grandparents had been at home when Nazis invaded their home and vandalised it, carried off my grandfather to prison for the crime of being at home when Nazi thugs came and invaded their place, and I suppose the so-called crime of being Jewish. So I thought I couldn't help but think of that, even though I know that it was not Nazi Germany and it was not state orchestrated, but the emotional reaction is triggering, and you can't help but think of those historical events.
And did you speak to members of the Jewish community about this incident in its aftermath?
Yes, I mean this was all the talk of the Jewish community, as you can imagine. Even though the Adass synagogue is a very small section of the Jewish community, it was something that all of us felt, whether we're members of Adass or members of another Orthodox stream of Judaism or non-religious Jews. There are many Jews who are not religiously observant and who would have felt the same pain and probably were triggered to feel the same emotions.
You then go on to talk about what you've called the summer of terror that followed from about October 2024, so the attack on the kosher catering business in Bondi, the torching of cars and graffitiing of cars and buildings in Wallara, and other incidents, and you go on to describe the profound psychological impact that had on members of the Jewish community. What was the community telling you around that time about how they were feeling?
Well, this was the time I think people started talking about, do we need a plan B? I mean, there might have been some talk about that before, but it really started in earnest, I think, with the Summer of Terror, which included the Adass synagogue attack, the attack on the kosher catering business, and we now know that they were state orchestrated, and the government took action sometime afterwards when that came to light. But the other attacks also had a similar impact. It was like, you wake up every day and you think, I dread to turn on the news because cars were being torched. The former home of my colleague, Alex Rivchin, you would have heard from him yesterday about that being the subject of an arson attack. There was a kindergarten, for heaven's sake, near a Jewish school that was mistaken for that school and was also subjected to an arson attack, which only reopened the other day. There's an old saying that anti-Semitism may start with hatred of the Jews, but it doesn't finish with the Jews. I mean, the destructive impacts of anti-Semitism, as I suspect with the other forms of racism, are ultimately ruinous of the entire society in which it occurs. It's not just the targets, it consumes everything.
And when you refer to the attack on the Adass synagogue and the kosher catering business being state-sponsored, you're referring to ASIO's subsequent finding that they were sponsored by the state of Iran?
Yes, correct, and particularly by elements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has since been proscribed.
You refer in your statement to the neo-Nazi rally that was held outside New South Wales Parliament House in November 2025. What struck you as different about that incident to other incidents leading up to it?
Well, it was a paramilitary style lineup of neo-Nazis. This time they weren't masked as they had been in previous occasions. They were out in the open. And they were lined up in front of the New South Wales State Parliament, the oldest parliament in the Commonwealth. It's been around since 1824. It is a symbol of our democracy. And they were standing outside of that parliament on Macquarie Street on a Saturday morning calling for the abolition of the Jewish lobby. I take it that they were referring to me and other people like me who represent Jewish institutions and Jewish organisations. What really disappointed me was the reaction of the New South Wales Police. Now, I say this as someone who generally has a high regard for our law enforcement people. I have a great respect for the work they do, but I think on this occasion, as they did on October the 9th, 2023, the wrong call was made. There should have been an application by the police, in my view, to the Supreme Court to oppose that gathering from taking place on public safety grounds. And when I heard the police say, oh, but you know, what they were saying was not a criminal offence and the gathering that they were proposing was not a criminal offence, that's beside the point. It might be right, it might be wrong, but in any event, it's beside the point in my view. Because just the previous month, the New South Wales Police had done the right thing. They had stopped another march that had been proposed to the Opera House on the second anniversary of October the 7th, and they had opposed that on public safety grounds. Now, public safety grounds don't just mean the risk of a crowd crush. Public safety grounds can mean a lot of things. And having a phalanx of neo-Nazis on Macquarie Street where people are passing by, a person of colour could have passed by, a person wearing Jewish religious clothing or Muslim religious clothing could have been passing by, and to overlook the public risk, the risk to public safety that would have constituted, seemed to me to be a gross error of judgment. And I believe if the police had challenged that in the court, they would have had a very good chance of succeeding. And even if they hadn't, the very fact that they had attempted to stop it from proceeding would itself have conveyed a very important message. But personally, as a former lawyer, I believe they would have succeeded.
Then came in December the attack at Bondi, and you refer to the messages of support that you received in the aftermath. But where did those messages come from?
All over Australia. There were some official messages of support from faith communities, which were very welcome, but I would say 2 years too late. But nonetheless welcome and appreciated, and I responded to each of them and thanked them. But also just unsolicited messages by email through our website portal and directly from Australians of all backgrounds from all over the country, just as we had received after October the 7th and just as we had received after the Adust fire on December the 6th, 2024. There was an outpouring of these messages, but there were also a sprinkling of hate messages, what do you expect, and you personally, you're a baby killer and you're responsible for genocide and all the rest of it. This reactivation or this endless repetition of the genocide charge and then throwing it in the faces of Jews everywhere, this is quite clearly an attempt to re-stigmatise Jews collectively, to re-stigmatise the Jewish people as a whole with collective guilt. In medieval times, Jews were stigmatised with collective guilt through the deicide charge, which was ultimately repudiated after 2,000 years by all the major churches. Now the attempt is being made, and I think quite consciously by some people, and unconsciously or unwittingly by others, to re-stigmatise the Jewish people with the genocide charge. And I saw some of that as well as all the messages of support and solidarity. And one has to recognise that process as being at the heart, I think, of the change in our culture to make it permissible now, even for people in the university space or in the arts and culture space or even in public health, for heaven's sake, to express views that are demonising and dehumanising of Jews.
You've also mentioned in your statement some of the anti-Semitic messages and threats experienced by the ECAJ and its staff. One example you give at paragraph 89 was on the 12th of October 2023, and the message said, "We're coming for you soon from Western Sydney." And you say attached to the message was an image of a man wearing a mask and brandishing a knife, standing behind another kneeling man dressed in an orange robe. And you say that your staff immediately recognised the kneeling man as the journalist who had been beheaded by the Islamic State in 2012. What steps did you take after receiving that message?
Well, the first thing we did was notify the police, of course, and they acted very promptly and very appropriately. They traced the individual responsible, charges were laid, and there was a conviction. We also notified our own security people, the CSG. But it's an unnerving message 5 days after October the 7th. And to me, the message was the atrocities that have just occurred in Israel, we're going to act them out here in Sydney soon. And you're going to be the target. That was the intended message.
And what sort of impact did that have on your staff?
It made it very tough for our staff. I mean, we're used to getting a lot of abuse, but because of the work that we do combating anti-Semitism, it brings you up against some pretty nasty characters. But that one in particular was very triggering, and it was just really the beginning of a succession of experiences for our staff that have culminated in us telling staff, if you ever need time off, just take it. If you ever need counselling, we'll organise it. If there's anything else that we can do for you, let us know. But we have incredibly dedicated staff. I'm very grateful to them for sticking with us.
And at a certain point you made the decision, or the ECAJ made the decision to turn off the comments on its social media posts on Facebook, except for those who had already friended or followed the page.
Yes.
What prompted that decision?
Just the torrent of abuse that was being placed on our social media pages by unsolicited sources elsewhere. Unfortunately, this is typical of what goes on social media everywhere. It's just the tip of the iceberg. But we thought, initially we thought, look, just let it out there, show the whole world, the ugliness of anti-Semitism. But after a while, it was just so overwhelming that we were being asked by our staff and members of the community to turn it off, and we did.
And you also received some advice about how you should go about monitoring for online threats and abuse directed at staff. What was that advice, and have you acted on it?
Yes, the advice was that we needed to do this. We needed professional monitoring to detect any early warning signs of an imminent attack on members of our staff or on our office. And so that was put into effect. last year I was engaged in a court case against a so-called religious hate preacher arising from some by now well-known events of hate preaching in November and December 2023. And even our lawyers who represented us asked us to arrange for monitoring so that they and their staff could be protected. So that's something that never existed in my day when I practiced law, but it's a reality of life now and an indication, I think, of what's changed in Australia for the worse.
From paragraph 101 of your statement, you have some concluding remarks about the impacts of anti-Semitism on the Jewish community. How has it impacted not just the way they think and feel, but also their behaviour?
Well, as one of the previous witnesses, Jeremy Stolinda, said, that it's created a price for being Jewish. I mean, there's always been a sense that it's dangerous to be Jewish. Okay, that's nothing new in history. But the sense that we had in Australia for most of my lifetime was, well, it's not really dangerous to be Jewish in Australia, or at least not that dangerous. And now the sense is that once again it is dangerous to be Jewish. And so people hide their Jewishness. A lot of people in my community who would have been very open about who they are and very proud of their identity. They're still proud, but they take sensible precautions. They will not necessarily wear their Magen David, the Star of David, as a symbol on their around their necks in their apparel. They won't necessarily walk with a kippah in the street as they might have before. The more religious members of our community, they'll put a baseball cap on top of it. They will not engage in conversations that they think might be dangerous conversations that might get them embroiled in conflict and argument with other people. And they'll be very wary about what they say in conversations. So even in a taxi or Uber or some other public context, they might just not respond to questions about who they are, what they do, and their views about things in the way that they might once have felt free to do.
Mr. Wertheim, you go on in your statement to make a number of observations about security for the Jewish community and recommendations for change. I can assure you the Commission will be reading those words closely and exploring some of those issues in later hearings, but for now I have no further questions of you today.
Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you.
Can I just raise one matter with you, Mr. Wertheim?
Certainly.
You talked earlier about many members of the Jewish community having family or friends living in Israel. Is it fair to say, in your experience, that ordinary members of the Jewish community who are Australian have an emotional attachment to the idea of Israel?
Oh, very much so. In fact, there's some statistical evidence, Commissioner, that you can avail yourself of. The most comprehensive one was called the Gen 17 report, which was conducted by Monash University. It showed something like 88% of Australian Jews feel that when Israel is in danger, they're in danger. 92%, I think, from memory, it was well into the 90s, who have actually visited Israel, of whom 60% have visited Israel multiple times. And a similar percentage who said that they feel a personal responsibility to see that to personally contribute to Israel's continued existence.
And at least as far as members of the Australian Jewish community are concerned, so many of whom have a background of family connection with the Holocaust, the importance of Israel is that idea that it's somewhere safe where ultimately one can go if one's a Jew.
That is certainly a part of it, but it's even deeper than that, Commissioner. It's a sense that that Israel is the point of origin of our people. It's the point of origin of the Hebrew language, of the Jewish religion, of our culture, our civilization, and so it's not just a safe haven. Because other places around the world have from time to time been suggested as safe havens for the Jewish people in previous times, and they were rejected because there was no historical, cultural, civilizational connection with those other places. The passion for Israel arises out of that deep sense of connection that has developed over 3,000 years.
And just over the course of your own lifetime, Israel's had governments of differing political persuasions. Has that attachment been constant, or has it varied?
I think that the sense of attachment to the country
that's what I'm taking up with you.
Yes, it is constant. Opinions about different governments that have come and gone in Israel, the variance of opinion is very great. These are matters of intense debate within households and with families, as they are within Israel itself. And it's the same with any government or any politics. There's always going to be a variety of opinions.
Thank you, Mr. Wertheim. Anything arising out of that?
No, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wertheim. You're excused.
Thank you, Commissioner.